Alright guys, we're going to try to help you out with your ball joint job today. We got Canadian Casey to help over there. See him?
How you doing?
Cool.
How you doing?
Alright, ball joints. We need to get the whole steering knuckle out of here. So we got some 18 millimeters on the back of these brakes we're going to get off. Casey's over here getting some cotter keys out of the ball joints, tie rod. So what we're going to do is grab our 18 millimeter and oh, these ones aren't 18s. These ones have Torx on this side. See if we can get a look. That one has a Torx for some reason. The other side is 18s. Looks like we got 18s there though. All right, so one side has Torx and one has regular bolts. Let's go. Fun stuff. All right, so get your brakes apart. That's the first thing. We'll take this caliper off, take this mounting bracket off, take this rotor off. If your rotor doesn't come off easily, hammer right in between the lug studs here on this flat surface if you're reusing your rotor. Don't hurt your friction surface or smack your lug studs. It'll break free. We're going to take this cap off of here because that's going to give us access to our axle nut. Alright, we got our brakes off. There's a 10 millimeter in this bracket here. Take that off. Unclip the wheel speed sensor. Locked into a couple clips here. Goes up around the shock. Unclip that sucker. Now we got the nut off the upper ball joint, the tie rod, and the lower ball joint. I left the nut just a few threads on the lower ball joint. Now we're gonna take this tie rod off. Well, the ball joint gave. That was kind of weird. Usually we hammer the ball joint, just like we're doing on this tie rod. There it goes. And the lower ball joint broke free too, so that's pretty cool. Usually you have to hammer on the knuckle right here and right here. But they all came off for us, so that's sweet. That rod feels tight. So now we can lift up, unthread that nut, left that nut on there so it didn't just fall down. We got our CV axle. If yours is stuck in there, use a punch and a hammer or an air chisel on that center dot. Push the axle back. And that'll just all slide off there. Now that that steering knuckle's off, we can grab our snap ring pliers. If they've never been replaced, they might have little factory slots in them that you have to chisel back. We got another snap ring on the underside of the upper ball joint. Oh, that one's on there good. We're gonna take our 10 millimeter wrench. Get this grease fitting off. I'll get that snap ring out and get the ball joint press set up. Alright, we've got our ball joint press all set up. Probably want to grease your threads before you use it. I'm using an open cone here because the ball joint comes all the way out here. And this is going to press it down that far. And that should be enough to whack it out. So that's my setup. You can rent one of these from the parts store, get your money back when you're done using it. So I'll just there we go. See, it's pressed out. Now it might not come out, it might still be in there enough. I just take a socket and a hammer and boom, it'll knock right out of there. That's how you press them out. About the same story on the top, except for the top one presses upwards. So get your cones right for the top one so you can press it up. That one presses down on the lower. Here's my setup for the top ball joint. The upper ball joint has a little notch or a hole, and that faces the wheel. I cleaned out these holes with a little wire brush. All right, so make sure you have that hole facing outwards. We got her all set up to press on the top one. We're pressing downwards. So make sure your stud down here is going through the open hole of your press. That's how we're gonna set it up. We'll just tighten her down so she presses all the way in. You should be able to run your thumbnail under there when it's all pressed in, and you shouldn't be able to get your thumbnail in. Should be nice and flush. All right, we got that top one pressed in. Zerk fitting, grease fitting installed. Little 8mm there. Snap ring put in. Now we got our set up for the lower ball joint. Had to hover up for where the ball joint's gonna go up into it. Got our snap ring and greaser on here. Make sure it's facing away. That's greasable once the steering knuckle's on. So now I'm gonna lift this steering knuckle up. We're gonna start with sliding it through the axle and wrapping it under the lower ball joint and just getting that bottom nut on a couple turns. So I'll do that right now. I put a little bit of grease on the splines to help that fit through there. All right, so we tightened up the lower ball joint nut. Not final torque. Final torque on that should be 94 foot-pounds. But zipped it up so that the axle shaft could clear that Zerk fitting. And then the axle came through. And then align up your upper ball joint stud with the steering knuckle. Might have to move the stud a little bit, but get it lined up. We had to use a floor jack with a chunk of wood to lift up on the lower control arm to get some threads showing. But now we're connected. Now we just gotta tighten the upper and lower control arm bolts, or ball joint nuts. Put our tie rod back in, tighten her up. We're gonna put our washer and axle nut back on here. That was a 36mm and it's 177 foot-pounds. So we're gonna get everything tightened back up. All right, we got the lower ball joint nut torqued to spec, cotter key through. We're gonna bend that cotter key down. Same story with the upper. Tie rods back to tight. Just need to throw the cotter key through. We gotta tighten down our axle nut. We got the washer inside there, 177 foot-pounds. So yeah, everything's pretty much thrown back together besides the brakes. So we're gonna tighten this axle nut down, throw the brakes on, get this wheel speed sensor back in its homes. It's got that little bracket clips into, a little spot right here, goes up and around, clips into the wheel speed sensor above the shock. Put our rotor back on, put our mounting bracket back on with pads, throw the caliper over it, make sure you got those nice and tight, those 18mm. This upper ball joint was a 18mm or 11/16. The bottom one was a 22mm, 18mm on the tie rod. And I think that pretty much sums it up. I don't think I mentioned that was a 10mm on that bracket right there. Make sure you grease up your ball joints. Don't forget about that. Make sure this fitting right there is pointing in a way you can grease it. We got a pretty good angle here. And there's a good time to clean up your brakes too. These are dry and rusty, so we clean all the brakes up before reassembly. Looks like this guy needs a sway bar link nut right there. New sway bar link snapped off. Time to check everything. This hub assembly has some noise. Spin it around, see if it's noisy while you got the steering knuckle off. What do you think? Does that do it, Casey? Did we touch everything?
I think that does it for the old Chev today.
Yeah. Don't forget to plug your sensor back in. Make sure it's in a way that won't get caught in the tire or anything. Use some zip ties if this little guy snapped off on you, because that's common. All right.